Shalom, shalom. I'm Joel Sanchez with Crucified Life Ministries, and today this teaching is done in association with Wisdom In Torah-Talmidim Teachers. And in this short, brief video, we're going to be looking at Paul and Corinthians. And the topic that I've chosen today to speak briefly about is dealing with competition and equity. And this was something that Paul dealt with all throughout his letters in Corinthians, because this was something that it plagued not just the society of Corinth, but it actually bled over into the believing fellowships, and Paul seemed like he was constantly dealing with the spirit of competition and dealing with exhorting the brethren to how to show equity and to stop showing partiality and whatnot. So with that said, let's get into it. So Corinth was actually a city in Greece. But in 146 BCE, it was destroyed, and Rome came in and destroyed it. But like a century later, around 46 BCE, Julius Caesar actually had it rebuilt, or he began to re-establish the city as basically like a Roman colony or a Roman city. And he began to send there freed slaves to recolonize this destroyed city. And in those freed slaves, sure, there were Romans there, but there was also Syrians, Egyptians, as well as Jewish people. And so this city became very important. It was kind of like a booming city because it actually had two ports in it. So you with those ports, you actually had the door open to commerce, trade, and so it became very busy with businesses and even new money. New money started to come about there, and it wasn't necessarily old money. These freed slaves were beginning to become entrepreneurs, and they actually set up shop and started these small businesses and small shops where they began to sell their artisan works and crafts and leather and different things like that, woodwork, pottery, things like that. And so this Corinth, it became a hotbed for like the new money, and it actually it started, or it had an environment that actually bred competition in the realms of not just politically, but business-wise, and also socially. Because there during this first century there in Greece and Rome and Greco-Roman society, orators were real big. These people with their wisdom and the way that they spoke and their knowledge. And so a lot of the patrons, in order to up their honor and their status in society, they began looking for the best orators to become their clients, because the more orators that they had that could had greater abilities or a better gifting than the other patrons' clients, than their competitors, then that made them look good. And so it just became a hotbed for this spirit of competition and what we would call today is like everyone trying to climb the corporate ladder, and it doesn't matter who we step on in order to get to the top. We just want our piece, and we want to we want to make it to the top. So that spirit hasn't just something that's come about because of the American dream. It's been in society for a long time. And so, like I said, these new elites that had come to Corinth to set up shop, they had something to prove in having a good reputation, making a name for themselves, being known amongst the society as that's so and so, that's so and so. He does this. His name is actually on this road. His name is on this building because he paid to have it built. So that's kind of a brief history as to what was going on in Corinth when Paul was making his missionary journeys there. And so clubs and cliques, if you will, if I could use that word, began because of this spirit of competition and everybody looking for status and kind of hooking up with one another, and small businesses, forming fraternities, small fraternities, and little their own little subculture and their little groups. What happened was these clubs and these cliques, they began to develop, and once they were developed, they took on the attitude of kind of like the saying, us four and no more. So if you weren't a part of my club or a part of my clique, then the doors weren't opened for you. In other words, you were an outsider. You needed to stay over there while we're going to stay over here. Does that sound familiar? It should, because we still have that spirit going on today. If you don't believe like me, if you don't dress like me, if you don't look like me, if you don't talk like me, then you can't be a part of our group, because our group is so set apart that we can't have anything to do with anybody outside of our group, or those who don't meet the rules of our group. So anyway, that's a brief history as to what was going on, the attitude, and the spirit kind of sort of in the people there, in the new people, these new elites who were founding and becoming reestablished in Corinth. So Paul shows up, and Paul begins to deal with a lot of the not just injustices, but a lot of the areas where Paul was seeing that the church, or the body of believers there, they were not doing correctly. So Paul begins to address those areas. And one of those areas that I've already mentioned, competition, but the big area that I would like to focus on for the rest of this video is the area of equity. Now that's a term we don't hear a lot today because we're hearing a lot about equality. And I'll tell you what's being pushed by politicians. The equality that's being pushed by politicians is not fair or just. It's basically taking from one group or one individual and giving to another. And it doesn't really matter if that another is working or wants to work, or it's just this equality that's being pushed today in social justice. It's not like a biblical social justice. It has nothing really to do with equity because it's not fair. But let's talk about equity. First, we need to define equity and what that word means from a biblical perspective. So, the definition of equity is fairness and unbiased, as in the concept of justice in relation to a standard. So Paul specifically deals with this issue of equity or an injustice in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 22. Let's read that. Now in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it's not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, when you come together as a body of believers, I hear that there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. Verse 20. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry, and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the body of believers of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you in this matter? But I don't commend you. Now, the issue here that Paul is dealing with is, and the scripture doesn't really tell us, but through history, we can go back and confirm this. But during this time, you had these new elites, these people of name, these people who had money, who had opened their homes up to have like house churches or fellowships. And so what was happening was these groups, they had friends who were of the same status, had the same kind of money that they did, and the same influence. And what was happening was, when they were coming to Passover or the Lord's Supper or whatever to partake in this, they were bringing their own food. And of course they had money, so they were going to eat the more exotic food and the more costly food. And it was going to be like a 7-course meal, instead of just bread and wine, if you will. But the issue is when they would break out their food, if you weren't in their club or in their little clique, then sorry, we're going to eat here, we're going to drink, and be merry and do our own thing, and whatever you brought, then that's on you. We're not going to share this with you. And so this is what the equity, or the lack of equity, that Paul is dealing with in Corinth. And he's telling these people, I don't commend you for this, because this is causing division and strife, and you're causing like a hierarchy in a wrong hierarchy in the kingdom of God. And you need to stop this. If you're going to eat an extravagant meal and all of this, eat at your home before you come. If you're not going to share with others, then don't bring, this and then not share it. So Paul was dealing with the issue of the lack of equity. And it was hurting people, because the part of the reason why people came to the gospel in Corinth was because of the message that Paul was sharing. The message of freedom and liberty, and that in Yeshua there was no more oppression. And in Yeshua you were free, and there was no longer Jew nor Greek, slave. Everyone was the same. Salvation was the same for everyone. And so this message really rang forth in the first century because of the oppression that Rome, that Caesar and the imperial cult, that they had forced on everyone. So Paul's telling these guys, look, you guys are acting worldly. You're bringing your customs and your ways into the assembly, and this is not how the kingdom operates. Now, with that said, let's tie it into today. I was recently talking to someone who has a special needs child, and the question came about, or in the conversation, it arose that I had co-founded a Hebrew Roots International Teen Camp along with Mark and Linda Roth. And in this teen camp, I was asked, or it was brought to my attention, did we allow children with special needs to be a part of this camp? And I thought, wow, I haven't even thought of that, which I'm not a part of the accepting of the applicants or that process, but again, I had never even thought about children with special needs. Now, why do I bring that up? Because to my knowledge, we have multiple Hebrew Roots teen camps out there, but I don't think many of these camps are set up or equipped with the leadership to be able to handle dealing with special needs teens. Now, that's nothing against these teen camps or being critical of them, but the issue is, the point I'm making is that in order to have equity, it's fair and unbiased. And everyone needs to have the same opportunity. Because, see, these special needs children, they desire companionship. They desire to fit in just like any other teen desires to fit in with their peers and in a group. And so if we aren't providing a platform to integrate special needs children in our Hebrew Roots teens camp, or teen camp, then the question I have is, are we being equitable? Are we promoting equity? Let's take it a step further. I kind of mentioned earlier about division and strife, but when we set up a fellowship or we have a place in order for people to come, I'm not saying we shouldn't have rules and regulations. Don't hear that. But when we begin to restrict people because of the way that they dress, they look, or they talk, then are we being equitable? Are we being a fellowship, or are we being a social club, like what Paul was dealing with and we read in Corinthians? Let's talk about a little more about equity. Let me give you some examples. In our ministry, Crucified Life Ministries, we try to have a platform to promote equity. And one of the areas that I've really been putting down some roots here over the last year and a half is dealing with some indigenous tribes that live close to our farm here in Costa Rica, on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica. And these indigenous, their tribe name is Quebecer, Cabeecar. And these indigenous, they're just like any other indigenous group. They're the minority to begin with, and they're kind of isolated to their reservations. And you can see that in a lot of areas that they don't feel like they're included in the Costa Rican society. So I've done lots of favors for these indigenous, establishing a relationship with them, and I'll go and visit them and just hang out, at some of their farms. And one of the big, there's two areas, but one of the big areas is sometimes they need to go to the big city, which is like an hour and 40-minute drive for us. And so I'll take them or family members, and they ride with me. And usually my wife goes, and we take advantage of some shopping or something like that. But along the way, about 45 minutes into the drive, we come to like the first store, convenience store. And so we usually stop there because we leave early in the morning, and we go inside the store, and We usually get some bread or some little something or another, some juice, to kind of hold us over until we can get to the big city to have breakfast or to eat some food. Well, I have a carload of indigenous people. So I can do one of two things. I can go in, buy juice for me and my wife, buy something for us to eat, and get back in my vehicle and take off again, and don't do anything for the indigenous. Now, granted, these are people who don't really have a lot of money. Or I can go in and buy juice and bread, the same thing that I'm going to drink and eat, and buy that for everyone in my vehicle. See, that's an example of equity, and showing equity to those around us who may have a lower standard or a lower status, a social status in our society. And the other example that I'm going to close with is we've started a project, a business project, with as far as making chocolate. And so we're buying cacao beans from these indigenous people, from the Quebecer Indians. And the situation goes, there's only one association that's been set up to buy cacao from these Indians, and they're totally not being equitable. They're totally taking advantage of the indigenous, and they're giving them a terrible price for their beans. So with our project, it's a business, or the way I explain it, it's a business doing ministry and not a ministry doing business. Because we founded this business on the principles of justice and righteousness, but also to do equity, so that we can be an example for the one, our great King, who we represent, and that's Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so as we're buying these beans, what we've done is we're actually giving them a way better price. 60% better price than what this association is giving them. So of course, a lot of the indigenous are like coming, running, flocking to us to sell us their beans because they can get more. And we did this not just to buy their product, but we also did this to hopefully provoke the other association to have to raise their price and to actually show equity and to do an act of justice and righteousness towards these indigenous. And so hopefully through our efforts of trying to show equity, that everyone gets to benefit out of this whole situation. But those are just two examples that I wanted to share with you of how we show equity to someone in society who doesn't have the same level or status socially or economically maybe as we do. But it's time for us as individuals and Hebrew Roots communities to begin to show equity. Not just talk about it, but actually do something about it and to act it out. And if we'll do this, we will become a great witness for our King, and we will turn the heads of those that are in the nations, and they will see how just and how righteous our great King is. Until next time, I'm Joel Sanchez with Crucified Life Ministries. Shalom.